Okay, so we are now live on YouTube as well. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Parlor Talks from the Paul Robeson House and Museum. I am your host, or sort of like technical host today, Chris Rogers. Take he, him pronouns. You know me as like the volunteer program director at the Paul Robeson House and Museum, where I've been since 2015. The Parlor Talk series of events that we do is always is about extending on the sort of like legacy and contributions and, you know, the type of work that is resonant with the study of the Robesons, the scholarship of the Robesons, the activism of the Robesons, and making connections and continuing to lift up the type of work that the Robesons sort of lifted up during their time, and continue to make those connections today. So the Parlor Talks is always a great series where we can bring lectures and have just exciting conversations that are both, and sometimes, you know, locally relevant, but also globally relevant. And I'm excited that this conversation is a bit of both, in terms of seeing the economies of crops, of the sort of post-enslavement, sort of like the colonial condition, you know, still continue and navigate the world, and what is our, you know, ways of tracking that and ways of upending that. So I'm really excited for today's conversation. Glad to have a couple special guests with us. And without further ado, I think I'll go into a bit of our introductions for the day. And the title of today's event is based on the title of our author, Jori Lewis's book, Slaves for Peanuts, A Story of Conquest, Liberation, and a Crop That Changed History. So with us today, we have Jori Lewis and Anna Badkhen. So I'm pulling up their biographies now. So just give me just a second while this loads. Go ahead and read these out. So author Jori Lewis is an award-winning journalist who writes about agriculture and the environment. Her reports have appeared on PRI's The World, in the Discover magazine, Pacific Standard, and the Virginia Quarterly Review. She's also a contributing editor of Adi, a literary magazine about global politics. In 2018, she received the prestigious Whiting Grant for Creative Nonfiction, which I think helped support the beginnings of this work. Lewis splits her time between Illinois and Senegal. Slaves for Peanuts is her first book. And in conversation with Jori Lewis for today is Anna Badkhen. And I love this opening. Say, Anna Badkhen is a writer. Her awards include the Guggenheim Fellowship, the Barry Lopez Visiting Writer in Ethics and Community Fellowship, and the Joel Earl R. Selden Award from Psychologists for Social Responsibility for writing about civilians in war zones. She has published 6 books of nonfiction. Her essays, dispatches, and short stories appear in periodicals and literary magazines, such as the New York Review of Books, Granta, The Common, Scalawag, Guernica, the Paris Review, and the New York Times. Badkhen is a contributing editor to the Manoa Journal. And I also have to give a special shout out this afternoon to our local independent radical bookstore sponsor, Making World's Bookstore and Social Center, which is, you know, located not too far, about 4 or 5 blocks from the Robeson House, between 46th, the way I explain it is between 40, is on 45th between Walnut and Locust. The Making World's, you know, bookstore and social center has already is ordered Slaves for Peanuts, and it's available in store, but it's also available online through their bookshop. And I'll make sure that link finds its way into the chat. So shout out to our friends at the Making World's bookstore. and Social Center. Um, I look forward to seeing y'all soon. And without further ado, I'm going to pass the baton to Anna, who's going to really lead today's conversation. I'm really excited to see this conversation amongst two friends happen, and just to listen in and learn more about this very worthy book that I hope many people find out or like dig into soon. So thank you, and I'll pass the baton over to Anna.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you to Paul Robeson House and Museum. Thank you to Making Worlds Bookstore and Social Center. Thank you to everybody who took time off their Saturday morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are, to celebrate and learn from Jori Lewis and her astonishing, really wonderful, thoughtful and caring book, Slaves for Peanuts. Jori has been working on it for a very long time, and it is probably one of the most meticulous pieces of research that I have ever read in my life. And also, it is beautifully written. Jori takes you by the hand, and she's just such a caring narrator. So I'm not just saying this because Jori is one of my dearest friends in the world, but that too. That's another pleasure, just to have you in conversation with me here across the Atlantic. So Jori, just to let our audiences hear your voice a little bit, would you mind reading a passage from the book, please? And then we can build our conversation on that.
Okay, well, thank you, Anna, and thank you, Chris and Paul Robeson House and Making Worlds Books, everyone who's joining. We previously discussed reading a chapter it's in the generally the beginning of the book. Sorry, gotta find it now. It's called The Legend of Indocaro, and I don't think it needs any setup. So, several hundred miles up the coast from the Rio Pongo, where the Lightburns were doing a brisk business in peanuts and people, there was a place called Indocaro. In those days, Indocaro was not yet the large city it would become, with its name altered and shortened to Dakar, but was still a series of fishing villages hugging the rocky promontories of the Cap Vert Peninsula. This was the continent's finger, stretching itself as far as it could into the great ocean, and it was covered with a carpet of grass, flowers, and fat baobab trees whose spindly branches reached out to scrape the sky. The people of Indocaro were best known to the French for their habit of pillaging the ships that sank off the coast, of which there were many. Since they were just a short boat ride from the narrow streets and bustling warehouses of the prosperous island of Gorée, where the French government had a fort, they did a brisk business in provisioning that island's people with anything they might need or want. One day in 1840, in a historical story that feels like a legend, the chief of Indocaro approached the representative of a French trading house with some slaves to sell. The French merchant responded to the chief, "Keep your slaves, they are our fellow men, but I will give you anything you want from Europe for peanuts." There and then, the chief had an epiphany. He went to tell his people about this new idea. Because each slave can bring in enough peanuts to equal his selling price, instead of selling them, let's use our slaves to cultivate our fields, he said. From that moment on, the people of Indocaro promised to not only dedicate themselves to peanut farming, but also to tell their cousins and neighbors about it up and down the coast and into the interior, in the land between the rivers Senegal and Gambia and beyond. They preached the gospel of peanut farming far and wide, and so it spread. It was a peanut rush.
Thank you very much for reading that. So what was happening in Europe that it was no longer interested in humans and was interested in peanuts. You're
Well,
right.
yeah, so in 1840 is quite late, but the transatlantic slave trade had been ending progressively for different European countries since the beginning of the century. So the British and Americans outlawed the trade in 1807, 1808, and the French did, I think it's in 1820. And then later, the British actually abolished slavery itself, and the French would abolish slavery in 1848. So, slavery was on, or at least the transatlantic slave trade was on the out, going out. And, that's, well documented. I think most historians would sort of say that. And then at the same time, there's in Europe, the Industrial Revolution is happening, and the Europe, France and England, they're just starving for oil for many reasons. So they need oil to oil their machines, right? That's the hallmark of the Industrial Revolution, that things people used to do by hand were being done by machines. So the machines need to be oiled, their gears and that kind of thing. And then there's this kind of hygiene revolution that's happening at the same time, which had sort of increased the demand for soap, and oil is a key ingredient in soap. And peanuts were fitting in quite well to French soap makers' recipes for their soaps specifically, which because it has a chemical makeup that's very similar to olive oil, which had been traditionally used in their soap making. So that's what's happening, and that's sort of increasing the demand for peanuts.
So basically, Europe outsources not just the production of what it needs for its own enrichment and prosperity and comfort, but also the labor, right? And the labor is enslaved labor for the most part in West Africa, in the Senegambian region, what today is Senegal and Gambia, and parts of Mali, correct?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the relationship between the Industrial Revolution and slavery is sort of long and vast, also because of course, even American sort of, not just in the United States of America, but what I mean in the Americas, slavery in the Americas is providing European merchants with the capital to expand, which kind of kicks off the Industrial Revolution already in the 18th century. So there's this relationship, and it becomes sort of even evident. I talk about this just kind of briefly in the book. There's a kind of conversation happening like in the early 19th century, especially in the UK, about sort of cracking down on like sugar or things sort of coming from the colonies, as they say. So these New World colonies, because there's this recognition that they're grown with slave labor, and they're these super famous abolition campaigners like Thomas Clarkson are saying that we should, instead of supporting enslavement in like Jamaica or Barbados, we should boycott sugar or cotton or whatever, and then use our effort to invest in trading in legitimate commerce in Africa, what they call legitimate commerce, which is this which is trade in other items, not slaves. But of course, the legitimate commerce, they didn't kind of like look well enough to understand like where the legitimate commerce was being grown and how. Like what were the sort of labor practices of those
kind of the situation we still have today, right? When we use computers that have parts in them that are produced using enslaved labor or child labor in places where most of us don't like to look. So there's this kind of a history of willful ignorance, right, that has been playing itself out for centuries. But how does peanut, the title of the book, the subtitle of the book is a story of conquest, liberation, and a crop that changed history. So how does peanut factor into liberation? And I want to use this question to kind of transition into a conversation about very specific people in your narrative, the abolitionists of West Africa.
Yeah, I mean, the peanuts, the sort of story of peanut and liberation is kind of a long arc, right? There's a sort of long arc of history that happens. So it's first, the peanut is supporting an expansion of enslavement in West Africa. But it's at the same time, sort of the cornerstone of a kind of like social revolution as well. So it's kind of putting money into the hands of people who didn't used to be able to get money, right? And eventually, through peanut agriculture and the money sort of from peanut agriculture, some people are able to buy their freedom eventually, or to have options once they've gained their liberty to have kind of like an economic a place to make money and a kind of place in the world. Mm-hmm. So that's the kind of short story that there's this overarching arc. It goes up and down. It's like a wave sign.
Right. So I remember this was maybe a year ago, maybe a little over a year ago, you and I were having conversations about who will play whom in the movie. And we were talking about Walter Taylor and who would play Walter Taylor in the movie or in the TV series. So Walter Taylor was born to a family of almost enslaved and freed people from West Africa, right? And then at one point, he gets tangled for a little bit with peanuts and Boston. And then he basically creates this sort of like underground railroad, I guess, in San Luis in that. So can you tell us a little bit, please, about this character and who was going to play Walter Taylor? I forget. Was it Idris Elba?
I go back and forth about who should play Walter Taylor. I think my latest is that it should be John Boyega, but.
All right. Yes. Yeah.
Feels like the right one, but yeah. Okay. So if anybody knows him, get word, So Walter Taylor is the kind of heart and soul of the book, which is, sort of not in a way intuitive because the book is about Senegal and Walter Taylor is a man from Sierra Leone. His parents, it's interesting. You said they were almost enslaved. We don't know about their background. They were freed from a slave ship, or perhaps multiple slave ships, and resettled in the hills outside of Freetown. So in these communities where the British were settling what they called liberated Africans, or sometimes they called recaptives. So they're people after the end of the slave trade. The British policed the high seas, and when they found slave ships, they would bring the people to Freetown and settle them there. Right. In general, there are some exceptions. So his parents were, had lived that experience. We don't know, of course, whether or not they had been enslaved in their own countries before, or for how long they might have been enslaved inside the area. They were from what is now part of Nigeria. They were Yoruba-speaking people, and that's just. And so then when they came to Freetown, they were settled in an area that also had a lot of Yoruba-speaking people who had similar language and religion and customs, and that, in some ways provided a kind of shelter for them to live their lives in relative peace, right? So Walter Taylor he first sort of travels. It's interesting because, of course, like the liberated Africans, because they're kind of receiving this huge, they're kind of being targeted by kind of British missionaries and charities, right? So a lot of them are being educated And then they formed often a kind of, I call them middlemen, and kind of like middle, petite elite, like a small elite class of like clerks and some kinds of traders. There are, lawyers, all kinds of people who kind of rise to an intermediate level in the British administration of other colonies, right? So Walter Taylor ends up, he says, going to the Gambia, where he was a clerk. He says he was a clerk for the Navy, which administered the Gambia and administered Sierra Leone, to be honest, right? So, and then, clerks weren't super well paid. And at the time when he arrives in the Gambia in the late 1860s, the Gambia is just like full on, like they have taken to peanut agriculture really, really quickly. And so there are many opportunities. And so many people in the Navy abandon the Navy eventually and kind of work as traders, especially in this kind of like live peanut market. So I think Walter Taylor never says, but we can suppose that might be his parcours. And then eventually he's recruited to move to Gore, which is an island off the coast of Dakar, and Dakar, as I just said, by a Boston shipmaster, so who is also importing peanuts from the west coast of Africa to New England for many reasons. So that's who Walter Taylor is. He eventually becomes he joins the French Protestant mission in Senegal's capital city, in the sort of main capital, which is this place called Saint-Louis. And that's really kind of where his story sort of takes off. He eventually creates this shelter for runaway slaves. It's started as both a kind of, let's call it like an altruistic mission. I think it develops out of Walter Taylor's genuine relationships with people in Saint-Louis that he knows. The first sort of person that they, quote unquote, save, is the wife of a man that Walter Taylor knows, the wife of a tirailleur, who they're this the kind of tirailleur. They're like infantrymen. They're indigenous infantrymen for the French military. And so this man had a wife who, it seemed, had escaped slavery in some way, and her master had found her, and they had to like come up with money, or she was going to be like dragged back into slavery. So Taylor approaches the main Protestant missionary and says, "Can we take up a collection?" And they do, among the people of the church and other presumably other people in the community, and end up
in Saint Louis at first. This is still in Saint Louis at first.
Yeah, this is in Saint Louis. So that's what's happening. And so then, and then he develops this idea. He says, this population of people, the people who are sort of coming to Saint Louis, because it's a free, it's an area. So the statute, the French said that Saint Louis, French land should liberate those who step upon it. And so the French are kind of caught in this administrative nightmare for them, that they have to kind of bestow upon people their freedom, but they develop a number. Anyway, we'll get into that, I'm sure. They develop a number of methods to kind of slow it down. So like at the beginning, people would have to wait 3 months between declaring themselves in the city of Saint Louis and being able to kind of get their freedom papers, and I was even surprised that there was a thing called freedom papers, then I found them in the archives, which is sort of incredible. So Walter Taylor sort of sees this as an opportunity, like an opportunity to grow the mission. But I think it was also a genuine kind of a genuine interest for him, as a person who is also, lived a life so close to enslavement,
There is a moment in the book is incredible in so many ways, and because also there's so many narratives in it, and you hold in tension so many different ways of looking at the world, right, and capitalism and white supremacy and interpersonal relationships. And there is this two moments that bookend the story of Walter Taylor. One is when he is a child and he gets accused of stealing a book, which is, because they could. And then that theft haunts him into his later years when he is trying to advance in his missionary positions, and somebody brings it up. Oh, but when he was 13, 14, that they made that accusation.
15 or 16, it's unclear, that whole incident. Maybe we don't want to spoil the book for everybody.
Well, no, but what I want to see, this is what is interesting to me as your colleague, right? What you did with archival research is beyond my ken, because just the amount of the meticulousness of your research in the archives is incredible. But also you're researching people, like you said, you didn't even know that there was such a thing as freedom people. You're researching people who, by definition of this white supremacist world, were unarchived, right? So, so we talk now, we talk with Saidia Hartman about, working against the archive. How do you work against the archive in this setting? How do we know what we know about Walter Taylor, and how do we question, how do we evaluate, how do you as a writer and a researcher evaluate the narratives, your investigation into the lives of enslaved African people, freed, formerly temporarily enslaved African people of that era in general, because the records, I think that a lot of people would be curious to know about what the kind of records there are.
Sure. This book it took me a very long time to research this book. I used a number of different archives. So I guess that's part of the story, is the kind of dueling archive, like using multiple layers of things. Everything we know about, most of the things we know about Walter Taylor, said himself, right? So when I just explained Walter Taylor went to the Gambia, I said that Walter Taylor says he went to the Gambia and did this thing. I never found actually any record sort of corroborating that, but that doesn't mean anything because the records are poor, and that clerks of his class would not enumerate it in the archive, right? So that's just what it is, right? So we can take him at his word, or we understand. So there's the main archive where Walter Taylor is sort of talking about himself, and that is the French Protestant missions archives, which still exist, are still in the same building. It's kind of crazy, right?
Where are they geographically?
In Paris. Okay. So so those are letters that he's written to the director of the mission, or to, I don't know, sometimes it's the director of the mission, sometimes it's the assistant director, sometimes it was the treasurer, sometimes it's to the nebulous committee, right? So there are a number of ways that he's writing his own story, and we can't, there are no other, in a way, like records to sort of corroborate his story, right? But then for his childhood, as I said, this community in Sierra Leone was really intensively kind of like missionized and monitored by the Anglican missionaries, right? So then I looked at their archive. So these missionary archives are really interesting, and still I have to be read with like a little bit of skepticism, but because especially the Anglicans had a really deep administrative role in these colonies, there's a lot of kind of like straight information. I was lucky enough in Sierra Leone to find the court document when Walter Taylor was tried. When he was tried, there was like a fully, long deposition. It included like all the arguments, every person
as a child, when he was tried as a child.
Like he was 16, I think. He had a job. Like he was working.
So by our standards today here in the United States, he was a child. He was tried as an adult at the age of 16. Okay, gotcha.
Probably something like that. Yeah. So I found those court documents. So there are so many different layers to trying to understand these things. And where it was possible, I did go also to Sierra Leone and try to find Walter Taylor's relatives or anyone who might have known anything about the family. And I never managed to find anyone, right? Anyone personally, but I was also open to that, right? So those are the multiple layers I was kind of trying to use to construct the life of Walter Taylor. So and then yes, there were also like the Senegalese archives wherein Walter Taylor is mentioned occasionally, especially because he occupied an official position. And then the French colonial archives also. So those are, and strangely also, I did go to the archives in Boston for the Bostonian Society, because he worked for the shipmaster he was working for had eventually become the mayor of Boston for a couple of years. So, and he's this kind of like Boston high society type. And there are some of his journals in the Bostonian Society. So I went to those. And yeah, Walter Taylor has not mentioned those either, but again, because the position he occupied was so marginal to Samuel C. Cobb in Roxbury, Massachusetts, who'd never stepped foot in Senegal, had other people who worked for them, and Walter Taylor presumably worked for those other people, but those other people didn't leave their papers, So there's so many kind of blockages between like how we can put together the story of Walter Taylor. When it comes to other people, it's interesting. Walter Taylor, in a way, starts to become a kind of a person through which we kind of mediate also the other stories of enslaved people who are completely inscrutable. Like we don't know anything about them except maybe from some of these missionary documents, which are propaganda documents, right? But because even though they're propaganda documents, doesn't mean we can't glean some information about them from them and use them in some way, right? And then there are, again, court documents. I have one chapter where I use a court document that has very short little narratives about where each enslaved person had come from, like how they ended up in this place. And that's a kind of sign. And then you see at the very end of the book me sort of trying to find living descendants of enslaved people and talk to them about their stories, which was completely fascinating, because many of them are at least a couple, and I don't think I even mentioned this in the book, that they had like a story of slavery in their history. They said, but they would try to kind of like distance themselves from it. Like maybe it didn't happen to them. Maybe they were just helping out those who happened to be enslaved. Who knows who those people are, right? Or they had this the kind of like mix of understanding. So like everything's happening at the same time. It's like it's slavery from the Americas, but also colonization, and also like Samori Toure. And it's like, okay, like all of these things can't be happening at the same time, but it's like the nature of oral history that it's impressionistic and kind of collapses time. But you can use those too, right? Like you can use those impressions, you can especially use those feelings, right? Because I think that's the truest part of it,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, somebody Phoebe Strom asked where the archives were. So we looked at Sierra Leone and Paris and Boston and Dakar and Saint Louis, right? You have this chapter 25 that kind of lists quotes from court documents about court documents for the 15 enslaved people who, quote, have clamored for their freedom. The court documents, and this is from 1878, said they were overworked beyond reason, were fed meager amounts of food that was often of poor quality. And these descriptions of, like, these distillations of human, or not distillations, maybe condensations of human lives and livelihoods into, paragraph long snippets, is what you have to work with, right, to create this narrative often. What happens with the peanut, to get back to the other main character of the book? What happens with the peanut when Europeans basically encourage West African farmers and chiefs and leaders and kings to plant peanut everywhere? I grew up in the Soviet Union, and I'm a little younger than that, but at one point, Nikita Khrushchev came to the United States, whacked his shoe on the podium at the United Nations, and fell in love with corn. And he fell in love with corn so much, he was just smitten by corn. He brought corn back and said, we're going to plant corn everywhere. Everywhere in the Soviet Union, we're going to plant corn. Well, unfortunately, corn doesn't grow everywhere. Like, the Arctic, it's not really good for corn. Huge vasts of land, but he destroyed crops in order to plant this new favorite crop of his. Then it turned out, and I only found out about this when I first came to the States as a guest at the age of 14, I think, with my parents. The corn that the Americans gave Khrushchev was feed corn, the kind that you have to put in a pressure cooker and cook for 3 hours before you can even sink your teeth into it. So basically, huge, vast swaths of land were destroyed by a whimsy of, a tyrant to plant an unviable crop. Now, what happens in Senegambia when the French and the Americans and other white Western powers encourage peanut production en masse?
Yeah, well, I guess though, Nikita Khrushchev might have been helping your new feed industry. So like, feed corn for like.
I tell you this. So I came to the States for the first time with my parents, and I don't remember where it was, like day 3. We're completely blown away. We're coming from the Soviet Union still. We're just like, what is, it's like in 1989. And it was a long day, and we're very hungry, and we're coming home to the place where we're staying, and I am starved beyond description. And our host says, "Are you hungry?" And I said, "Yes, I'm starving." And she's like, "It's okay. We're just gonna make you some corn. You like corn?" And I loved corn, but I also knew that it took 3 hours to cook. And I thought, oh my God, I don't think I can handle 3 more hours. And that was when I found out that actually, all you need to do is bring it to a boil. So we just know we didn't. And we'll talk about, the idea of manipulation of diets for profit a little bit later. But but I want to hear about what happened in Senegal and
region. Well, nothing as crazy as that, right? So it's not even clear to the extent to which so the peanut was already being grown in Senegal, right? So like it'd been grown in a kind of, I don't know, diffuse way for a long time. Like nobody even would know how long. I mean, presumably it doesn't, for some 300 or 400 years or something at that point, right? Or three, anyway, some multiple hundred years, many hundred years.
Since about the 15th century when the first,
yeah. So the peanut was widely grown, I think, pretty much throughout the western coast of Africa. I don't know enough about East Africa to make that claim, so I cannot say. Like I know it was grown there as well. But it was grown in like kitchen gardens, maybe along with smaller crops. It wasn't grown at wide scales like cereals like millet or sorghum or whatever else people were growing mostly, but maybe along with some vegetables like okra or with cowpeas. So people knew what it was, and that's why this story that I read, this kind of mythical story, which actually is from the archives. People say it, and it sounds like a myth, but it's like written down somewhere. The story about this guy, sort of like, I'll give you anything. You can imagine where it happened, even though no one explains that. But you can imagine him going to a field, seeing these things, saying like, these peanuts, these are the things I want. And people are like, well, we have those. We grow those occasionally. So it was a question of ramping up production rather than like introducing a novel crop, because even though it is a novel crop, because it comes from South America, it had been grown for so many years already and within Africa. Now, of course, like the peanut has, it has some, ecological niches it prefers, prefers certain types of soil. So very early on, this area, Kajor, is sort of recognized as being a kind of prime peanut growing land because of its Jor soils, these sandy soils, lightweight sandy soils. I don't know if that answers your question. I think I went off on a little jag.
Well, but then, so beautiful soil for peanuts, but then something happens to the peanut.
Well, so the book is kind of subtly taking us through. So I was trying in the book to, so I was receiving signs like as I was going through the kind of archival pile I had and looking at various places where the peanut had been produced progressively. So when the demand for the peanut sort of first started, even though this story that I read at the beginning about Indocaro happened, but in fact, the main place to export peanuts earlier on was further south, like in this area that's now Guinea, that they called at the time the Southern Rivers. And so this area had a lot of labor because in fact it had been settled by a number of Euro-African kind of like clandestine slave traders. So these are people who were still plying the transatlantic slave trade long after it was illegal. So they're basically like outlaws, they're kind of
like the Badlands in your book. It's just really, it's kind of a creepy such a setting there. Yeah, maybe it's the jungle.
It's kind of the jungle because it's all on kind of swamps essentially. Yeah. I've been to that area actually, not to do research. I think I went there for a different story when I was writing it. And I realized I was there in this area, and it's like they're just, spits of land kind of divided by these huge swamps, right? So it's very easy to imagine, a kind of clandestine slave trader hiding out there because there are so many places to hide. So this area had been growing since like even the 1830s on some level and like a pretty large scale. And then like over a time, and then it kind of progressively moved up to like the area we also know as Guinea-Bissau and to the Gambia. So that's also why in the 1860s and Walter Taylor's there, the Gambia is really already online, just growing a lot of peanuts, right? But by and the Gambia still grows peanuts, but anyway, there are many reasons why. But over time, the merchants start sort of talking to each other and to the administrators about like the peanut quality is sort of going down, and they don't really know why. So this is a kind of a signal I'm picking up as I'm going through the archives, and I'm like, what is happening? Like when I read their agriculture situation reports, they're all saying like, oh, the peanut crop's going to be bad. Ugh, like there's this disease. They call it like the sickness with no name. Like, who knows what this thing is that the peanuts are dying, and nobody really knows. So this is a kind of mystery I kind of try to draw out through the book, because eventually it starts sort of, near the end of the book, you see that it's also affecting the glorious golden peanut lands of Kajor as well. And, it's due to so many factors. It's due to principally to this kind of, reverse, what they call like a reverse selection, that there's essentially so much demand for the peanut. People are forced because of their debts and their indebtedness to sell their seed peanuts, and they're getting back just like junk seeds. But it's also about, environmental degradation because of monoculture, and also probably because of deforestation. So there are all of those things, even though the principal thing is this kind of reverse selection because of the demand for peanuts, and because there's a kind of like almost no responsibility in the exploitation of peanuts. It's just like simply extractive without understanding the larger kind of sort of ecological place it should hold. Because of course peanuts are they're legumes. They fix nitrogen. They're great. They're a great crop to grow in rotation, but not to only grow.
Yeah. I think about this work also as giving heft to the modern conversation about extraction and environmental irresponsibility. We talk, now, of course, we talk almost constantly about irresponsible, heedless consumerism, or ways in which industrialist capitalism and supremacy destroy the environment. But the seeds of that, the tradition of that is old, and I feel that Slaves for Peanuts gives a great kind of foundational understanding of this is what we've been doing. We've been at it for a very, very long time. So let's talk about manipulation of diets for profit. What happens to peanut? Sure, peanut is used in the soap industry and to grease the wheels of the Industrial Revolution, but also it infiltrates diets, right? It changes diets. And you talk a little bit about this in the book. Can you give us some hints?
Yeah, I think you're talking about, I have one sort of chapter about it. It comes kind of midway through the book about Senegal's national dish, chabujen. And I say that chabujen is, for those who don't know, which I presumably is most of you, chabujen is Senegal's national dish, and it's rice and fish and some vegetables. But of course, even though Senegal is not, some areas of Senegal grow rice, but it's not a huge rice growing place. It's a place where normally the staple food is millet, right? So then we must also ask ourselves from the beginning a question about why this country that mostly grows millet has this, like, its national dish is just this rice and fish dish. Although of course fish makes sense because there's so much of a coastline. But so anyway, in the book, I say that this development of chabujen as a national dish is in fact probably related to peanut production, because as the demand for peanuts grew, people were growing less millet. They were deciding instead of to grow millet, they would grow peanuts, because with peanuts they could get like money, they could get specie, they could get like hard cash, right? And so and more of it, right? and there was so much demand for it, they just stopped growing so much millet. And then there's also even a passage in the book where, the French even say, like, we should promote the importation of rice, and so that we have like two sides of the trade. We import rice and we buy peanuts, so they're like having two sides of the trade. So they even the French, even at that time, I think it's like in the 1850s, see that connection. They're like, they should grow peanuts instead of millet, so we can, and then we import rice.
Yeah.
And then I mentioned this briefly in the book. I don't, so I'm not a didactic writer. I'm not like, this is what you must learn about this thing. So a lot of the things that I'm writing are very subtle, so you pick it up. But I do say in the book that the French had this, this tirailleur corps, and it gets even bigger over the years. But like even in the 1850s, 1860s, it existed. And for that tirailleur corps, they are this corps of infantrymen, indigenous infantrymen, who are instrumental to the later conquest of the interior. In fact, they're giving them rice, right? So they're giving them rice for a few reasons. I think not at the beginning so nefarious, but they're already adapting this kind of group of people to eating rice, which they hadn't before. But I think one of the reasons was that millet's very hard to transform. So like the troops would have to like travel with all these women who were pounding rice, right? And it was kind of a hassle because then it added more people they had to like feed, and there were some kind of like, there's a few social problems, right? Because then instead of like a military of fighters, you've got like essentially families, like kind of traveling with the troops. So there are all these reasons that they kind of switched to rice, which is easier to cook. It doesn't require as much transformation. It doesn't require any really. And so that's part of it, but they adapted this whole kind of like emerging, let's call them, I guess they're kind of like a kind of emerging middle class almost, because then there are these people who go on to kind of like have more access to education and have more ability to like do trade. So they're this kind of emerging middle class. They're like getting them used to eating rice too, right? So all of these things kind of work together.
It's fascinating. And fascinating also in its complexity, that there's not, I love that the book is, as you described, not non-didactic, because it's impossible to be didactic in this messy world that we're making. I have a question for Chris, actually. Are you with us still, Mr. Rogers? Hi. So I would love to know, as the official representative of the Paul Robeson House and Museum, and you're muted, what do you think Paul Robeson would want to know?
I mean, there's so much. I'm sitting here like with my little notes and going in on a couple of things. So there's a couple topics that are just coming up to me. I think first is also to acknowledge that I have to also bring Eslanda Robeson into the room, someone who committed so much of their life to traveling across Africa. For folks who may not be aware, you can find one of her pamphlets online. What do the people of Africa want? That came out through the Council of African Affairs. So it's kind of like Paul and Eslanda, right? And I think one of the pieces that I think is coming to me more through Paul is in particular like it's like the art of the writing. And Anna, we spoke about like just how beautiful, and Jori, like how beautiful your writing is in the storytelling, and like refusing the didactic, refusing just the simple explanation, and thinking of like the role of narrative in this, right? And I think with Robeson, someone who's a polylinguist, right? They say, conversing in something like 22 languages, someone who understood the role of studying the role of people, everyday folks, and realizing that different choices and the risks that they took to sort of like subvert and challenge these sort of like dominant orders of exploitation, and put that into song, right? And use those songs to travel across the world. I would really love to talk about like the work of, translation, moving across language, and really, seeking to uncover these stories of resistance, and what that means. And I think, from the Robeson House standpoint, it's something that we sort of like, we try to unspecialize, right? Like there are folks that are spending years and years in the archives, right? But there's also something important about us everyday folks also having an attunement to what's possible and what can be discovered from the archives to subvert and challenge the sort of like dominant order. So I would love to ask about just like moving across language, what things you found that could not even easily be translated. I know you even spoke in the earlier sort of like preface about the types of stories that couldn't be recovered, or the types of people's histories that couldn't be recovered because they were not there in the archive. So I think that it was possible to like returning to the archive and how you translate and stylize that to give people access into a world where their power is in their own hands.
Mm. Well, thank you for that question. I mean, it's so, I think that part of what I thought that, Paul Robeson might be interested in, which actually the part we haven't really spoken about, which is the Lat-Jor conquest of Kajor narrative, because it's so, is so, sort of linked to his influence on this kind of like post-colonial struggles and his friendships with so many African leaders at the time too, right? Like, so Kwame Nkrumah, and I forget, I'm like having a little brain freeze about who else, but I was just thinking about, to answer your question, and then maybe we can dial back to Lat-Jor about the language and the narratives. It's not, yeah, I mean, like I mentioned earlier, like you have to kind of read multiple things at once, right? And kind of understand. And I think I actually especially felt that reading the materials about Lat-Jor, which is maybe why I brought him in, and also just because we haven't mentioned him yet, and he's great. But or he's a great character. Maybe he's not great, but the Lat-Jor is interesting because when you go to the archives, you get just reams and reams of his letters, his correspondence, of course, with the governor. We're missing, of course, maybe sometimes, unless they were intercepted, his correspondence with other people, although they were sometimes intercepted. And you see this because the French had like this bizarre, kind of like spy service or something, essentially. But so then, Lat-Jor's letters are in fact written in Wolof, so it's like Wolof written in Arabic script. I do not read that. I cannot read that, and they're translated into French, and then I'm translating them into English. So there's like a telephone chain of translation here. And, so there are any number of ways you kind of have to read those things, like understanding like how they were made legible and sort of like palatable to like the French administrators, how we understand them today. So there are all these layers related to it. And because Lat-Jor is also a kind of almost like superhero figure in the Senegalese canon, there are also a number of oral histories written about him. There are plays written about him. There are a number of source materials you can kind of draw upon to draw a kind of composite figure, both from the French perspective, which was that they really kind of vilified Lat-Jor in a number of ways, especially in the media. There are a lot of contemporaneous newspaper accounts of the conquest of Kajor. And then like couple that with these oral histories where Lat-Jor is like, also a supernatural being practically, who has to be killed with a silver bullet, it's like silver, gold, and copper mix. He has to be killed with a magic bullet. And, just try to read those things together and I would like triangulate the information as much as possible. So that's how I tried to do it with a person like Jor, that's possible, right? For a person like Walter Taylor, it's less so. And for a person like, you know, in my book, one person we think is liberated who was a part of the mission, this guy Samba Kumba, it's impossible because, like, you know, in half the documents, we don't even know Samba Kumba's last name, right? So I just tried as much as possible to cover like all the bases, like any possible place where I could find any information. And then I would kind of, maybe I was sort of channeling Saidiya Hartman also, like just kind of inspire myself and infer. But I try to make it clear that that's what I'm doing. Like, if we can speculate, you know, that this is this thing, you know, and can we draw out a kind of narrative about what could have happened, what might have happened. I think I also do that in a chapter I talk about freedom, right? So, well, we don't know what happened to all these people. In fact, like, the people who were freed are almost lost to our archives, right? Typically, they get freed and then they just go off into the sunset to live their lives peacefully. But yeah, we can only sort of speculate by what else is there. What are the other signs? Like, what are the narratives people picked up? So the man I go see at the end of the book, who talks about, yeah, that his grandfather, or I can't remember if it's his grandfather or great grandfather, was a healer, was like a medicine man, and he made charms to help keep people safe, and then they settled around him. So that already gives you a sense that the people who had a kind of shared experience of insecurity and trauma and violence gathered together among themselves and others who they thought could keep them safe. So they tried to support each other. And I think that gives you just that story, even though, you know, maybe we don't believe in magic, maybe we don't believe in charms or whatever, or maybe you do, I don't know you, but but that gives us a signal that there was a kind of intentionality that people use to create their own communities out of these kinds of struggles. I don't know if that answers your question. I hope that answers your question.
No, I mean, I'm someone who doesn't really believe always in answers, but responses, and that certainly keeps me going. So I'm extremely grateful for that. I know, and Anna, thanks for the invitation. I know I'm gonna help sort of work through our Q&A today, and we have some things. I think I'll take a little facilitator sort of like privilege and say, I think one thing that immediately threw me for a loop coming into the knowledge of this book was, my Black American self and the Black History Month figure. You get George Washington Carver, right? And you know about George Washington Carver and the peanut. And I'm like, oh my God, the peanut is now such this shadowy thing. So I feel like there was just one part where I was just like, oh my God, this changes my whole perception. Like, George Washington Carver and peanuts, like, what's happening now? You got to also connect this history to it. So in terms of that, like, cross-Atlantic, transatlantic story of the peanut, I also, appreciated, like, deepening that. So we do have a couple questions already that are coming up. The first person I'm gonna come through is Julie. I'm gonna give you a space to unmute if you would like, and just kind of narrate your question, if you will.
Am I unmuted?
Yep, you're unmuted. We can.
Okay, yeah, I really wanted to just comment on the very interactive and, entangled stories of all these people, similar to the peanut roots and how they spread out. Your story is many faceted. The agricultural side with the peanut production, the interesting lives of the different tribes and chiefs and damals, and then the missionaries helping create free societies and liberating, the people that were enslaved. I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed the book. And your characters, although they were taken from archival information, you brought them to life. Like, I could picture Lat Jor and Walter Taylor and all the other missionaries that came to help him. So I think that you had a very specific talent in doing that because the characters really spoke. And I have just a favorite actor that might be in there. I love Amin. I don't know if you know him. He's currently producing the Porter series on BET, but he worked with Idris Elba on Yardi, the movie. But I could picture him totally as Walter Taylor.
Oh, I have to look him up. Thank you for that. And thank you for those words about the book.
Yes, Phoebe, I'm gonna come to you and give you an opportunity to unmute if you would like to, share one of your questions. There you go.
Yeah. In growing peanuts in the US, did that come from Africa and knowledge that the slaves brought from Africa? Or did it come from South America originally? And I mention this because I never knew, I'm a white Caucasian, European focused in many respects. And we went to a rice plantation in South Carolina and learned, near Charleston, and learned that Africans were specifically recruited for their rice growing capabilities, not totally unskilled laborers, which was my preconceived notion of the slave. So I wonder if, one, there are other examples of, besides peanuts, and was peanut an example of that, and peanut growing? And what other examples are there where slaves were brought over with specific, for the specific knowledge they contained, and that notion that they had experience, and that notion is a really important aspect of the slave experience, perhaps in South America as well as in the US. And it's not one that is widely, at least it's not widely known to me.
Okay, well, thank you for that question. So peanuts were not a targeted crop in the United States. So then there wasn't really a kind of,
I see,
a concerted search for that knowledge. For rice, it's been well documented. There are a few well-known books about it. I think one's called Black Rice, and then there's a couple of them.
Okay.
The American colonists and later American plantation owners searched specifically for people in these rice growing regions that I just mentioned, so which is part of southern Senegal, all the way to Sierra Leone, what they called, I think actually even to Liberia, they called it the grain coast. And so it was known that they wanted they were searching for those types of enslaved people in South Carolina, but also in like northern Brazil. That was like a big thing. For
okay.
the peanuts, our best understanding is that the peanut did arrive in the continental United States, in fact, from Africa. That's a supposition. We don't really know exactly why. I've actually never been sort of sufficiently so no one's ever sufficiently answered this question about why didn't if the peanut was in Mexico, why didn't it just cross the Rio Grande and move up through Texas or something, so I don't know, but that I think I would imagine it's because there wasn't maybe much trade or much commerce in between those areas. Like the peanut, we know in the United States was starting to be grown mostly in Virginia and those areas is pretty far away from
coastal regions, which actually had the sandy soil. So that makes some sense.
Yeah, exactly. And so then peanuts were also, at least in some cases, used occasionally for slave ship provisioning. And again, because peanuts are easy to plant if you haven't treated them, it's supposed that the peanut did come from Africa to America, where it was again just grown, and it maintained that reputation as a plant that was just grown by by enslaved people for themselves, essentially,
I
right?
see.
Growing it in their kitchen gardens, just to eat, just because, you know, we have an understanding. I think it's normal that we have this understanding that this kind of like big plantation systems. So like enslaved are just like growing cotton or sugar. But of course, people had their own little, like they had their own little plots where they're growing their own foods, and peanuts were ostensibly one of those.
Then my other question was the
Oh,
laborers.
I'm sorry, Phoebe. I'm sorry. I just know what our limited at time. I want to.
Oh, sorry.
Some other voices. I appreciate you though, and
No.
Asabi has this keyboard that is just doing her so wrong. So I want to give you a chance to kind of vocalize your comment.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'm getting a new keyboard, but it's not here yet. My eye sticks, so the spelling looks crazy. I was just in the concept of people chosen to participate, or people being recruited gives the idea that there was some kind of free will and volunteerism in coming. And I don't think that recruit fits the narrative of how Africans got into the new so-called New World, into the United States and the other Caribbean and so forth and so on, South America. So I was just, every time you said that recruit, it just kind of like was pinging me and I had to say something.
Understand.
Yeah, but having background in Sierra Leone and family through marriage in Gambia, and you know, so your story is putting together pieces that I've been wondering about, as in how did people in Gambia? Okay, I do a lot of Yoruba culture practice, and I've been trying to put this all together. And how did people in Gambia say that they were familiar with some of the cultures of the Yoruba that is in so-called Nigeria now? And this thing of people having been taken from ships that never actually got to the New World and then resettled into Sierra Leone has put together a big piece that's missing in my research of family history and African American history into back to the continent. Thank you for that.
So then is your family, they're liberated Africans in the Gambia? Because they are, yeah.
I'm married a Gambian, Senegambia, so they're the same people. But my history of my family here in the United States, so far I've been able to document it almost back to the 1600s, but they stayed in the same area of Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina. So those were the people who came. They were the Igbo people, they were the Yoruba people, they were the Sierra Leone people. And I've been able to document on my maternal side a connection to a 100% Sierra Leone woman. But I'm seeing how did these people get there, and what you're researching this book, and I haven't read it yet, but I can't wait. And I can't wait to give it out to other people, has put together such a big piece in the puzzle for me and helped me to see my way forward in what I'm trying to do. And thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
How are we feeling? I see one more question. That all right? We kind of pull our afternoon to a close. So Jennifer, I'm coming to you. Your final comment of the day.
Actually, it's Barb's question. Yeah, I was wondering if now, today, the landscape of Senegal is changed forever by the peanut farming that happened there. Are there native crops that are no longer able to be grown? Are there other native species that have been wiped out because of the farming? That kind of thing. How has it changed the landscape?
That's a good question. Of course, like, what do we know about the baseline landscape? It all comes from like early naturalists. Yeah, I think there's been a fair amount of deforestation. I tried to explain a little bit about that in the book, but there's like Kajor, which is the main sort of side of the book. was at some point more forested, and now it's like just a big sandy plain. You know what I mean? It's not just, there are some sparse trees, stands, but it's not at all what these sort of early naturalists described sometimes with these larger forests or larger sort of, brush areas, right? I wouldn't say, there are, of course, many local plants still being grown, and there are movements to kind of to bring local fruits and local cereals sort of back, right? So there's the kind of fonio movement, which has been, I think there's this cereal called fonio. It's kind of like millet, but it's smaller. And that's been kind of revived by a number of different people to even be exported, I think, now. So that's a kind of local grain that's been given a kind of like new lease on life. And there are any number of other vegetables or, fruits or seeds or whatever where that might be possible, but you need a kind of like, you need the political will also to support those movements, and that tends to be missing. Yeah.
Thank you. We read the first couple chapters of your book and we're absolutely enthralled.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
So it seems that the casting is continuing. Folks are
really?
figuring out this series, this limited series. We're about to, bring ourselves to a close this afternoon, but I want to give our guests, time for final comments or thoughts from today or to Jori as well, or from Jori to everyone else. But I'll begin with you, Anna.
Oh, thank you so much, Chris, and thank you so much, Jori, for this wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, everybody who attended and took part in our casting game. We will pass on. I think that Idris Elba is winning, and also, as Julie points out, and Jori also mentioned, he is from Sierra Leone, so there is some connection there. So I think we're going to just forward it to Hollywood and say, hey, I urge you all, of course, to buy the book. It's beautiful. You will enjoy it. Yes, there you go. We can all hold up our books. Thanks, Jen and Barbara. Thanks, Chris. You can buy it at Making Worlds Bookstore and Social Center in person or online, or you can of course buy it at your favorite independent bookseller. And tell your friends about it in person, on social media. If you enjoyed it, if you enjoyed this conversation, follow Jori. Maybe Chris, you can put Jori's Instagram handle or Twitter handle here in this chat so that people can follow her around. Jori also lives in one of the most beautiful places in the world, Indocaro, which is now called Dakar, and sometimes takes really gorgeous photographs of the land that is not all completely devastated by the peanut and white supremacy. So thank you all very, very much for coming. Jori, it's such a pleasure always to talk to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't have any other comments to say about Slaves for Peanuts, but thank you so much for Anna for organizing this and bringing me this wonderful connection with the Paul Robeson House Museum, which I hope to visit on my next time in the US, inshallah. And thank you for all these wonderful questions and listeners. And I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you both. It's been exciting to get deeper into your work. Thank you, Anna, for introducing it to us and allowing us to, really have this space and build this, relationship. I have a special guest, if folks haven't noticed already. Our executive director is here with us. So thank you, Janice, for stepping in for a moment. I know it's been a busy morning for you. But introduce, I don't know, just give a second to say, Janice, you over there? Thank you.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. Thank you, Chris Rogers, for always representing us and the Robeson House so wonderfully. We appreciate all you do. Thank you, Anna, and thank you, Lori, for being here. We've been so excited about your event coming, and we were happy to be the hosts today for this event. And thank you, all of you. I'm looking at everybody joining in and just really being inspired by this whole dialogue and conversation. So we're going to probably talk about Chris and I doing part 2. So let's say this was part 1, and at some point later on, we can have you back for our Parlor Talks series and talk about a part 2.
Yes.
Everybody likes that.
Yes, for sure. And I think one of the immediate connections for that is we're currently in the midst of building our own, archive space and really championing the role of community archives and what's possible from them. And I think you have a lot to say about that. So certainly we will, be in touch about that. We want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. The conversation has been archived on YouTube. I'll make sure I add all of Jori's contact information to the description there. I want to thank you, many of you who chose to donate and support ongoing programming at the Robeson House and Museum. Make sure you get a hold of this book and, continue to follow the story of Slaves for Peanuts as it travels across the world. And thank you. Thank you. I just want to wish everybody a great weekend, and we look forward to continuing to see you. And yes, thank you from the Paul Robeson House and Museum.
And to all the mothers, happy Mother's Day.
Happy Mother's Day.
Yes, so, appreciate you all.